The first rays of sunlight stretched across the endless plains, painting the dry grass in shades of gold. A weathered wooden sign creaked gently in the morning breeze. The faded letters read Hawthorne Ranch, though time had nearly erased the name. Beyond the sign stood acres of cracked fields, broken fences, and empty cattle pens that had once been filled with life. The ranch had been famous years ago, but now it looked forgotten, as if hope itself had packed its bags and left. Dust swirled across the dirt road leading to the old farmhouse. The porch sagged under its own weight. Several windows were cracked, and the paint peeled from the walls in long strips. Every corner of the property whispered the same story: years of neglect, failed harvests, and impossible debts. Inside the farmhouse, Ethan Hawthorne stood silently by the kitchen window. At 34, he carried the weight of constant failure on his shoulders. Dark circles framed his tired eyes, and his rough hands told the story of endless work that never seemed to pay off. Bills were stacked on the worn wooden table beside him, each one demanding money he simply did not have. He stared out at the empty pasture where hundreds of cattle had once grazed. Now only a handful remained. Another payment was due in less than 2 weeks. Another loan had been denied. Another neighbor had quietly suggested selling everything before the bank took it. Ethan clenched his jaw. Selling the ranch felt like betraying generations of his family. His grandfather had built the place with his bare hands. His father had spent every waking hour protecting it. Losing it would mean losing the last piece of his family's legacy. A loud knock interrupted his thoughts. His closest friend, Jake Morrison, walked in without waiting for an invitation. "You look worse than yesterday," Jake joked, tossing his hat onto a chair. "I feel worse," Ethan answered without smiling. Jake looked around the kitchen before shaking his head. "You need to stop staring at those bills. They aren't going to disappear. They might if I burn them." Jake laughed. "I've heard worse ideas." For several minutes, they stood in silence. Outside, an old tractor coughed but refused to start. A loose shutter slammed against the side of the house every few seconds. The ranch itself seemed exhausted. Jake finally broke the silence. "The whole town is talking." Ethan didn't ask why. Small towns always talked. "They're saying the Hawthorne Ranch won't survive another season." Ethan sighed. "They're probably right." Jake leaned against the counter. "Unless something changes. What exactly is supposed to change?" Jake had no answer. Neither of them did. By noon, Ethan drove into town to buy the cheapest supplies he could afford. The streets were busy, but conversations seemed to pause whenever he walked past. Some people offered polite smiles. Others looked away. A few whispered. Everyone knew about his debts. Everyone knew the ranch was dying. The local diner buzzed with lunchtime chatter. Farmers, mechanics, and shop owners filled nearly every table. Ethan ordered coffee and sat alone near the window. At the table behind him, 2 men lowered their voices, but not enough. "Won't be long before the bank owns that ranch. I heard they're already preparing the paperwork." "It's a shame. His grandfather would have never let things get this bad." Ethan gripped his coffee cup tighter but said nothing. Arguing wouldn't change reality. Across the diner, laughter suddenly erupted. Several customers turned toward the entrance. A woman had just walked inside. She was taller than most people expected and carried herself with quiet confidence despite her size. She wore a simple blue dress, practical boots, and held a basket filled with homemade bread and jars of fruit preserves. Her name was Martha Collins. Everyone in town knew her. Not because she sought attention, because people rarely allowed her to disappear into the background. Some judged her before she even spoke. Others made careless jokes after she passed. She ignored every stare with remarkable patience. Instead of reacting, she greeted the waitress with a warm smile and walked toward the bakery counter. The room slowly returned to its conversations. Ethan barely noticed her. His mind remained trapped by overdue payments and impossible choices. Meanwhile, Martha carefully arranged her homemade goods on the display shelf. Every jar carried a handwritten label. Every loaf of bread looked perfectly baked. The bakery owner inspected them with an approving smile. "They'll sell before sunset," he said. "I hope so," Martha replied softly. "I made extra this week." "You always do." She smiled politely. There was kindness in her expression, but also determination. She wasn't someone who waited for life to become easier. She simply kept working. As Ethan left the diner, a gust of wind swept across the street, scattering several papers from his folder into the air. Bills, loan notices, past due statements. Sheets flew in every direction. People stepped aside. No one moved to help. Then Martha quietly set down her basket and hurried after the papers. She caught one before it disappeared beneath a wagon, another before it landed in the muddy road. One by one, she gathered every page until the folder was complete again. When she handed it back to Ethan, she offered nothing more than a gentle smile. "I think these belong to you." Ethan accepted the papers, slightly embarrassed. "Thank you." "You're welcome." For a brief second, their eyes met. Neither of them realized that this ordinary moment, lasting no more than a few heartbeats, would become the first step toward a future neither of them could possibly imagine. The dusty wind settled. The street grew quiet again. And somewhere beyond the horizon, change had already begun. I can continue with Scene 2, 700 words, where the town's cruel joke about Ethan marrying Martha begins to unfold.